January 5th, John F. Kennedy stands on the Capitol steps taking the oath of office as the 5th President of the United States. The crowd is massive, the atmosphere electric. Every living former president has been invited to attend. Herbert Hoover is there, elderly but present. Dwight Eisenhower, who just handed over power, sits prominently on the platform, but one former president is conspicuously absent. Harry S. Truman, the man who rebuilt Europe, contained Soviet expansion, and established the framework that won the Cold War, wasn't invited to Kennedy's inauguration. And it wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. Kennedy wanted Truman nowhere near his presidency, and Truman knew exactly why. This wasn't about policy disagreements or political differences. This was personal. This was about something Truman had said about Kennedy's father, years earlier, something the Kennedy family never forgave and never forgot, and it was about what Truman had done during the Fay campaign that nearly cost Kennedy the presidency. You need to understand how thoroughly Kennedy froze Truman out. For 8 years under Eisenhower, Truman had been treated with respect. He was invited to White House events, consulted on foreign policy, given access to classified briefings. He was an elder statesman, a living connection to the dramatic decisions of the face. The moment Kennedy took office, all of that ended. Truman wasn't invited to state dinners, he wasn't consulted on policy, he wasn't given security briefings. White House staff were instructed not to take his calls. When Truman wrote letters to Kennedy offering advice, they went unanswered. Kennedy treated Harry Truman like he didn't exist. And the most shocking part, Truman understood why. He'd seen it coming. Because the roots of Kennedy's hatred went back to Fay, to something Truman had said about Joseph Kennedy Sr., something so insulting, so publicly humiliating, that the Kennedy family had been waiting years for revenge. Let's go back to understand what happened. In Fay, Harry Truman was still establishing his presidency after Roosevelt's death. Joseph Kennedy Sr., the former ambassador to Britain and one of the wealthiest men in America, wanted back into politics. Specifically, he wanted Truman to appoint him to a cabinet position or ambassadorship. Kennedy had been ambassador to Britain before World War II, but he'd been forced to resign in disgrace in Fay. Why? Because he'd been a Nazi sympathizer, not in the sense of supporting Hitler's racial policies, but in the sense of believing Britain should surrender to Germany. That democracy was finished, that the future belonged to fascist strongmen. Kennedy had given interviews saying democracy was dead. He'd advocated for Britain to make peace with Hitler. He'd spread defeatism throughout Washington, arguing that America shouldn't help Britain because Britain was going to lose anyway. Roosevelt had tolerated this for a while because Kennedy was useful. But eventually it became too embarrassing and Kennedy was pushed out. By Fay, Kennedy wanted rehabilitation. The war was over. America had won. Kennedy figured everyone would forget his defeatism and he could return to power. He approached Truman through intermediaries, suggesting he'd be valuable as an advisor on European affairs or as an ambassador somewhere prestigious. Truman's response was brutal and public. In a press conference, a reporter asked if Truman would consider appointing Joseph Kennedy to any position. Truman's answer, "I wouldn't appoint Joseph Kennedy as dog catcher. He is a Nazi sympathizer who wanted Britain to surrender to Hitler. Men like that have no place in American government." The room went silent. This wasn't diplomatic language. This was a sitting president publicly calling a prominent American a Nazi sympathizer. The quote was on the front page of every newspaper the next day. Joseph Kennedy was humiliated. His reputation, already damaged, was now destroyed beyond repair. He would never hold another government position. His political career was permanently over. And it was Harry Truman who had killed it with one contemptuous sentence. Kennedy never forgave Truman, but more importantly, he raised his sons to understand that Truman was an enemy. Joe Jr., the eldest son, being groomed for politics, died in the war, but John, the second son, got the message. Harry Truman had humiliated the Kennedy family, and someday that debt would be repaid. Fast forward to Fay, John F. Kennedy is running for president. He is young, charismatic, wealthy, well-connected. He is also Catholic, which is a huge liability. No Catholic has ever been elected president. There is deep anti-Catholic prejudice in America, particularly among rural Protestants and Southern voters. Kennedy needs every advantage he can get. Party unity is essential, and that means getting the endorsement of the party's elder statesmen, including Harry Truman. Truman didn't like Kennedy. He thought Kennedy was too young, too inexperienced, too dependent on his father's money. Truman preferred other candidates, particularly Lyndon Johnson or Stuart Symington, but Truman knew the party would probably nominate Kennedy anyway, and when that happened, Truman would be expected to endorse him for the general election. Except Truman had no intention of doing that. Not unless Kennedy apologized for his father's behavior during World War II, not unless Kennedy publicly acknowledged that his father had been wrong to sympathize with the Nazis. Kennedy refused. His father had drilled into him that Truman was the enemy, that the Fay insult could never be forgiven. So Kennedy told Truman through intermediaries that there would be no apology, no acknowledgement of his father's mistakes. Truman decided he would not support Kennedy's nomination in July Fay. Just before the Democratic convention, Truman made a shocking announcement. He would not attend the convention. He was resigning as a delegate, and he was urging the party not to nominate John F. Kennedy. Truman held a press conference explaining his decision. He said Kennedy was too young and inexperienced. He said the nomination was being rigged by Kennedy's father's money. He said the party was making a mistake that would cost them the election. But the real message was in what Truman didn't say. He didn't mention Joseph Kennedy's Nazi sympathies explicitly, but everyone understood that is what this was about. Truman was refusing to support the son because of the father's sins. The Kennedy campaign was furious. This was a disaster. Truman was still hugely respected in the Democratic Party, particularly among older voters and union members. His refusal to endorse Kennedy gave permission to other Democrats to withhold support. It made Kennedy look weak and illegitimate. Kennedy had to respond. He held his own press conference, and it was masterful. He said he had enormous respect for President Truman. He said Truman had every right to his opinion. But he, Kennedy, was running for president, and he welcomed Truman's scrutiny and expected to earn his support through his campaign. It was a perfect political response. Kennedy looked gracious and presidential, while subtly suggesting Truman was being petty and outdated. The press ate it up. Suddenly the narrative shifted. Truman looked like a bitter old man clinging to past grudges, while Kennedy looked like the future. Truman realized he'd miscalculated. He'd wanted to damage Kennedy, but instead he'd made himself look bad. The party was rallying around Kennedy. Truman's opposition was backfiring, but Truman wasn't done. As the general election approached, with Kennedy facing Richard Nixon, Democratic leaders begged Truman to endorse Kennedy. The race was incredibly close. Truman's support could make the difference in key states like Missouri, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Truman refused for months. He watched Kennedy campaign, watched him handle the Catholic issue, watched him debate Nixon, and Truman remained silent. It was extraordinary, a former Democratic president refusing to endorse his party's nominee in a close election. Finally, in October Fay, just weeks before the election, Truman gave a grudging endorsement. He didn't campaign with Kennedy. He didn't give speeches for him. He simply released a statement saying he would vote for Kennedy because Nixon was worse. It was the most minimal endorsement imaginable, and Kennedy never forgot it. Truman's refusal to support him had nearly cost him the election. The Kennedy family saw it as confirmation that Truman was an enemy who would undermine them at every opportunity. Kennedy won the election by one of the narrowest margins in history. Just Fay votes out of Fay million cast. The race came down to a handful of states, and in Missouri, Truman's home state, Kennedy won by only Fay votes. Some Kennedy advisers believed that if Truman had campaigned actively for Kennedy in Missouri, the margin would have been larger and the legitimacy of Kennedy's victory would have been less questioned. They blamed Truman for making the race closer than it needed to be. So when Kennedy took office in January Fay, he had a list of people who had opposed him, people who needed to be punished. Harry Truman was at the top of that list. The freeze-out was immediate and total. Truman had been accustomed to receiving courtesy briefings from Eisenhower's administration. Kennedy's team cut him off. Truman wrote to the State Department asking about developments in Berlin. His letter was ignored. Truman called the White House to offer congratulations and advice. His call wasn't put through. A secretary took a message. Kennedy never called back. In March, Truman attended a Democratic Party event in Washington. Kennedy was there. They were photographed shaking hands. In the photo, you can see how cold the interaction is. Kennedy's smile doesn't reach his eyes. Truman looks uncomfortable. They exchanged maybe words. That was the only time they spoke during Kennedy's presidency. Kennedy's staff made the exclusion explicit. Pierre Salinger, Kennedy's press secretary, later admitted they had instructions not to involve Truman in anything. Kennedy told his team, "Truman tried to stop me from becoming president. He doesn't get access now that I am." The most humiliating snub came in April, during the Bay of Pigs crisis. Kennedy's botched invasion of Cuba was a disaster. Former Presidents Eisenhower and Hoover were both briefed and consulted. Truman, who had dealt with Stalin and made the decision to use atomic weapons, who probably understood Cold War crises better than anyone alive, was completely shut out. Truman found out about the Bay of Pigs from newspaper reports like an ordinary citizen. No briefing, no consultation. He wasn't even contacted afterward when Kennedy was looking for advice on how to handle the fallout. Truman was hurt and angry. He told friends that Kennedy was petty and vindictive. He said Kennedy was governing like a spoiled rich kid who couldn't handle criticism. He said the Kennedy administration was making serious mistakes because they were surrounding themselves with yes men and excluding anyone who might offer unwelcome honesty. But Truman kept these criticisms private. Mostly he understood that publicly attacking a sitting Democratic president would only make him look worse. So he suffered the exclusion in silence and watched Kennedy's presidency from the outside. The freeze extended to symbolic gestures that should have been automatic. In there was a ceremony honoring the anniversary of the Marshall Plan, Truman's signature achievement in rebuilding Europe. Every living person involved in the Marshall Plan was invited to the White House for the commemoration. Except Truman, the president who had created the Marshall Plan, wasn't invited to celebrate it. When asked about this by reporters, Kennedy's press secretary said it was an oversight. It obviously wasn't. It was a calculated insult, a reminder that Truman was persona non grata in Kennedy's White House. Truman's friends urged him to make peace with Kennedy. They told him he should apologize for opposing Kennedy's nomination, that he should reach out and offer to help the administration. Truman refused, he told them. "I said what I said because I believed it. I'm not apologizing for telling the truth about Kennedy's father, and I'm not going to grovel to get back into Kennedy's good graces." There was a deeper issue beyond the personal grudge. Kennedy and Truman represented fundamentally different types of democratic politics. Truman was a New Deal liberal who believed in unions, working-class politics, and straight talk. Kennedy was a new generation, wealthy, Ivy League, educated, focused on image and style as much as substance. Truman looked at Kennedy and saw everything he distrusted about the modern Democratic Party: too slick, too focused on looking good instead of doing good, too comfortable with wealthy donors and corporate interests. Kennedy looked at Truman and saw the past. A rough, unpolished politician from a dying era. Someone who didn't understand modern media, modern diplomacy, modern politics. Neither could respect the other's approach, and that fundamental difference in political philosophy reinforced the personal animosity. The strangest moment came in October during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy brought the country to the brink of nuclear war confronting Soviet missiles in Cuba. It was the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. The closest humanity came to nuclear annihilation. Truman had dealt with Stalin for years. He'd stood up to Soviet expansion in Europe. He'd made the decision to use atomic weapons. His experience in nuclear brinkmanship was unmatched. You'd think Kennedy would want his advice. Kennedy never called him, not once during the days of the crisis. Truman found out the crisis was happening from watching television like everyone else. He had no special briefings, no insider information, no opportunity to offer counsel. After the crisis ended successfully, Truman sent Kennedy a brief telegram of congratulations. Kennedy's response was a form letter thank. That had clearly been written by a staff member, no personal note, no acknowledgement of Truman's experience or expertise, just a generic thanks that could have been sent to anyone. Truman told his wife Bess, "I helped build the system that let Kennedy solve that crisis. I established containment. I stood up to the Soviets when they were expanding, and Kennedy couldn't even pick up a phone to say thank you for the foundation I laid." The exclusion wasn't just symbolic, it had real policy implications. Kennedy made decisions about Cuba, about Vietnam, about civil rights, without consulting someone who had dealt with similar challenges. Truman had desegregated the military. He'd faced down military leaders who thought they knew better than the president. He'd navigated impossible foreign policy dilemmas. Kennedy could have learned from Truman's experiences. Instead, he repeated some of Truman's mistakes and missed opportunities to benefit from Truman's hard-won wisdom. By late Fay, the freeze had lasted almost 3 years. Truman was effectively exiled from Democratic Party leadership, despite being a former president. Younger Democrats took their cues from Kennedy. If Kennedy didn't want Truman around, they didn't want Truman around either. Truman was becoming irrelevant, written off as a relic of the past. The party had moved on. Kennedy was the future, and the future had no room for Harry Truman. Then November Fay happened. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The news reached Independence, Missouri, where Truman was having lunch at home. Someone called to tell him the president had been shot. Truman's reaction was complicated. He immediately issued a public statement expressing shock and sympathy. He called it a tragedy for America. He praised Kennedy's service and potential, but privately, Truman's feelings were more mixed. He told close friends that Kennedy's death was terrible, but that Kennedy had brought some of his problems on himself by being reckless. He suggested Kennedy's handling of Cuba had created enemies. He said Kennedy's style over substance approach had made him vulnerable. These were harsh assessments to make about a murdered president, but they were honest. Truman didn't pretend to mourn Kennedy as a friend or ally. He mourned him as an American president whose death was a national tragedy, while recognizing their relationship had been poisoned beyond repair. Truman attended Kennedy's funeral. It was the first time he'd been inside the Kennedy White House. He sat with other dignitaries watching Jacqueline Kennedy lead the nation in mourning. The funeral was state theater on a grand scale, exactly the kind of carefully staged event Kennedy had excelled at creating. After the funeral, Lyndon Johnson, now president, met with Truman. Johnson had been Kennedy's vice president, but had been largely marginalized and excluded. He understood what Truman had experienced. Johnson told Truman, "That is over now. You're welcome in this White House any time." And Johnson kept that promise. For the 5 years of Johnson's presidency, Truman was brought back into the fold. He was consulted on policy, he was invited to events. He was treated as the elder statesman he deserved to be recognized as, but the damage had been done. 3 years of exclusion had made Truman irrelevant to a generation of Democrats. When Truman died in Fay, the obituaries focused on his presidency, but barely mentioned his post-presidential years. The Kennedy freeze-out had erased him from contemporary relevance. Looking back, the Truman-Kennedy feud reveals something ugly about American politics. Personal grudges, family honor, and revenge can outweigh national interest and party unity. Kennedy let his father's humiliation dictate his treatment of a former president who could have been a valuable advisor. Truman, for his part, let his contempt for Joseph Kennedy's Nazi sympathies prevent him from fully supporting John Kennedy's candidacy, even though Kennedy's politics were closer to Truman's than Nixon's were. Both men put pride ahead of pragmatism. Both men let personal animosity cloud their judgment, and the country suffered for it, because Kennedy could have benefited enormously from Truman's experience if he'd been willing to set aside his family's grudge. The most revealing comment came years later when Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, was asked why Truman had been excluded from the Kennedy administration. His answer was chilling in its honesty. He insulted our father. We don't forget insults, we don't forgive them, and we make sure the people who insult us pay the price. That was the Kennedy philosophy. Loyalty was everything. Enemies were never forgiven, and Harry Truman, by calling Joseph Kennedy a Nazi sympathizer in feuds, had made himself an enemy of the entire Kennedy family for life. The tragedy is that both men were right in their own way. Truman was right that Joseph Kennedy had been a defeatist and Nazi sympathizer. The historical record is clear on that. But Kennedy was right that holding the son responsible for the father's sins was unfair. If both men had been willing to separate those issues, if Truman had supported Kennedy despite his reservations about Joseph Kennedy, and if Kennedy had acknowledged his father's mistakes while charting his own course, they could have worked together. Instead, they let a feuds-old grudge poison their relationship and rob the country of what could have been a productive partnership. When Truman was asked in later years about Kennedy, his answer was always the same. He was too young, too inexperienced, and too influenced by his father. I said that in feuds, and I still believe it. His death doesn't change the fact that I was right to question his qualifications. It was classic Truman, honest, blunt, unwilling to soften his position even after Kennedy's death, and it explains why Kennedy froze him out. Truman wouldn't bend, Kennedy wouldn't forgive, and neither man would admit the other had any valid points. The freeze out of Harry Truman by John F. Kennedy was one of the pettiest, most vindictive actions in presidential history. A young president punishing an old one for telling an uncomfortable truth, a powerful family exacting revenge for a feuds-old insult, and a former president exiled from his own party because he refused to pretend that Joseph Kennedy hadn't been exactly what Harry Truman called him, a Nazi sympathizer. In the end, both men lost. Kennedy lost access to Truman's wisdom and experience. Truman lost his relevance and influence in his final years, and the country lost the benefit of two Democratic presidents working together at a crucial moment in the Cold War. Sometimes the most damaging decisions aren't about policy or strategy. They're about pride, ego, and the refusal to forgive. That is what destroyed the relationship between Harry Truman and John F. Kennedy, and that is why one of America's most consequential presidents spent his final years as a political outsider, shut out of the White House by a man half his age who never forgot an insult to his father.